Hi, I'm author and designer Rebecca Kemp Brent. I love historical fashion, and sometimes I'm intrigued by the practicality of it as well. I love the open necklines from the teens and 20s all the way up through the 30s and 40s, and this was a time long before air conditioning, so it just made sense to take the neckline of a garment a little bit farther away from the body's neck and throat. It's cooler. So I enjoy making shirts with interesting necklines. One thing they all have in common, no matter the shape, is facings. So one of the things that is an essential technique for sewing is you have to learn how to finish the edge of the facing. Patterns don't usually give you a lot of guidance. There are a lot of options in sewing books. You can stitch and pink the edge, you can overcast the edge, although sometimes after using, wearing, and washing, you'll find that those overcast edges get a little ragged. And you can also use a serger to finish the edge of your facings, which is one of my favorite finishes just because it's nice and flat, doesn't add bulk. But my favorite finish of all is one that gives you such clean edges on both the inside and the outside of the garment that you don't see any of the seam allowances at all. And you can even turn the facing to the outside of the neckline and make a design statement with it. So let me give you, first of all, just a real quick idea of how you can change the shape of a neckline on a pattern so you can do something fun. And I'm going to do the sort of sweetheart neckline of the 1940s. I think you'll recognize this when you see it. To start out with, I trace off the pattern pieces from my pattern, and it's a good idea to take a look at the back neckline of your pattern, even if you're just designing the front. Some of them will have a note on the pattern to tell you that that neckline has already been dropped or widened a bit. And you want to keep that in mind as you style your own neckline, because sometimes they sit farther out on the shoulders than you realize. And when you draw on a piece of paper, it can surprise you when you put the finished result on your body. Remember, you can always take a little more fabric off, but you can't add it back. So, for example, with a square neckline, it may look shorter and narrower on the pattern piece than the finished product is really going to look. So to give a good check on that, what I do is I cut the seam allowances off my pattern piece. And then I can just hold that pattern piece up to my body, and I can get a little bit of an idea of where the neckline is going to fall. Then I sketch in the design detail. In this case, this is half of my sweetheart neckline. This is the center front where the fold will be. And again, you can try this up against your body to see how it's going to look. And when you have just what you like, then you're ready to start making your pattern piece. This is the traced edge from my no seam allowances pattern. And then I have just added the 5/8 inch seam allowance back to it along the neckline and the shoulder. Be sure that you put X's on the lines that you're not going to use in your finished pattern, because as much as you think you won't forget, sometimes it gets really confusing. The next and last step is that I trace the outside edge of my facing, and you can make it echo the shape of your seam line, or you can make it a little different, whichever you prefer. And we're going to make sure that there is 1/4 of an inch of seam allowance around that outer edge. If you're using a pattern without altering it, the 1/4 inch is there. It's just probably called a hem allowance instead of a seam allowance. Last of all, I can make my 2 pattern pieces, one for the back neck, one for the front, and I cut those out of fabric and out of interfacing. This is where the process starts to get a little more interesting, although we're not quite at that fork in the road yet. But I'm going to go to the sewing machine and show you how to stitch this facing together. First of all, if you're going to turn this facing to the outside of the garment, you'll need to sew your shoulder seams first. You can use the same finishing technique for inside facings, and in that case, if you want to do it in 2 pieces, it's okay. But on the outside, you want to be sure that you're not going to have seam allowances showing on that outer edge. So I've started by sewing the shoulder seam in my facing fabric, and then I'm also sewing the shoulder seam in my interfacing, and that's a little different from what we usually do. This is fusible interfacing, and I've just taken it, put the 2 pieces right sides together. That's the side that doesn't have this interfacing, the fusible on it, and I've stitched my seam and then trimmed those seam allowances down to just a scant 1/8 of an inch. Next, I match up my pieces, right sides together. This is where it's really interesting because we haven't fused that interfacing on yet. So I'm going to put them with the non-fusible side of my interfacing against the right side of my fabric, and I'm going to go to my sewing machine, set it up for a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and sew that outside edge. You'll notice that I'm stitching with the fabric on the bottom and the interfacing on the top. And the reason for that is the interfacing won't stretch. In fact, that's part of the reason that we always interface a neckline edge, to avoid the stretching. So the fabric may have stretched a little bit, and if it has, the action of the feed dogs on my sewing machine will actually help to ease that back into place and get rid of any evidence of a stretch. And then when we get all the way around our facing, we'll just overlap the stitching a little bit and then clip, cut our threads. And now I need to do a little bit of trimming. This is going to be like any time that you are trimming something you're about to turn. So I want to cut my corners on the diagonal just to decrease the bulk. And then because the Sweetheart neckline has a little bit of a curve in it, I get to show you one of my favorite techniques. To get a really smooth curved edge, you need to be sure that the notches that you put into the seam allowance are small and regularly spaced. And the best and easiest way in the world to do that is just to use a pair of pinking shears. So I'm going to trim my curved seam allowances with my pinking shears. And then I'm ready to take this to the ironing board, finally. Were you starting to wonder if we just weren't going to fuse them? Okay, so over here at my ironing board. Now, remember as you're working that this is a fusible product, so you want to be sure that you don't fuse it to your ironing board. I'm going to use my fingers to turn this right side out, and then with the tip of the iron, I'm going to press just the very edge to start with. Really, all I'm doing at this point is fusing the seam allowances together. Once I have that done, then I can arrange the rest of the facing so the raw edges all match and use my iron to fuse. Now, you may also have noticed that I didn't stay stitch my neckline. That's a great thing to do. But sometimes when I'm working with a fusible product, I deliberately choose not to stay stitch just because I'm a little bit of a lazy sewer and I know that this fusible is going to hold everything in place for me. So after we get everything completely trimmed, turned, and pressed, look at this great facing that we have. And I think you can probably guess why I don't want to hide this on the inside of my garment. So we have one more step, which is that we have to put the facing on the shirt. This is where things are really different because I'm going to take the right side of my facing and I'm going to pin it against the wrong side of my garment. And always you should pin perpendicular to the seam allowance, but just for the magic of television, I'm just going to stick a couple of pins in that way. And then I'm going to slip over here to the back. And I'm going to use a couple of pins to act like my seam, just so I can do a little of it very quickly and show you. Remember that there's a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance on this neckline, so it's going to be a bigger seam than the one we sewed when we were putting the facing together. And we're going to stitch this, and then you'll trim and clip all of your curves again, and fold the facing to the outside edge of the garment. let me go back over to the table just for a minute, and we'll go back to this first couple of shirts that I showed you. One of the things that I love about this technique that I haven't mentioned so far is that because the interfacing is translucent, you can kind of see through it, you can use it to fussy cut. So I did a little embroidered motif and made sure when I cut this with my interfacing that the embroidery was going to be exactly where I wanted it on my facing. After I've turned and pressed this to the outside, just a little row of edge stitching with matching thread, or you could doll it up a little bit more with a decorative stitch if you like. So I hope you'll give these facings a try. Inside or outside, it's a wonderful technique to get a beautifully clean finish no matter what the shape of your neckline.